The first quarter of 2025 winding down, and with spring around the corner, it's the perfect time to assess your financial progress. Today, we're sharing tips on how to spring clean your finances with expert moves to set yourself up for financial success for the rest of the year. Okay, look, great to have you back here with us. You have some ideas for tracking your first quarter spend and using it to inform the rest of the year. Break that down for us.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me. So my best recommendation for getting started with auditing and spring cleaning your finances is to take a financial snapshot. And what this is going to do is show you how much money you are spending on essential things and non-essential things every month, with ultimately the goal to aggregate all of your expenses for the quarter. Those quarterly totals are going to surprise you. And when you look at them, what are you spending on your housing? What are you spending on your other essential living costs? And then what are you spending on that non-essential stuff? Maybe shopping or going out, or, those small leaks in your budget. And are there areas where you may not be feeling the ROI on that spend? The goal is to make sure that the money you're spending is actually adding value. So when you look at these totals, you can see maybe some of these monthly expenses that I'm not really thinking about are actually derailing my plans.
I'm already preparing myself for a massive yikes when I take a look at mine, but it's a good activity and exercise that you're suggesting here, and I'll report back on my findings for myself. But I'm thinking about some subscriptions here as well that people might have. How do you know if you have too many or if they are actually useful to you?
Absolutely. So when it comes to subscriptions, really the goal is to make sure that the subscriptions you're paying for are subscriptions that you're actually using. So what you need to do is set some thresholds for yourself, and those thresholds are going to look a little bit different for you based off of what type of subscription it is. So when I think of subscriptions, the very first thing that comes to mind is streaming subscriptions. And, we all have multiple streaming subscriptions, whether it be Netflix or Peacock or HBO Max. Which ones are you actually using multiple times a week? I actually just canceled one of mine because I realized I'm only using this maybe once or twice a month. Like, I'm not actually getting the ROI there. So for each subscription that you have, start counting how many times every week are you actually using it. And if you're not using it, 4 to 5 times a week, it may be something that you can cut out of your budget. And you can always go back and add it back in if you find that you're missing it.
How can you be more cadenced as well in making sure that this is part of, once you've gone through the assessment of kind of doing the spring cleaning and looking back on what you spent in Q1 and using that for your forecasting for the future, how can you be more cadenced and bake it into a routine?
Absolutely. So there are 2 things that I recommend here. First would be to start following either a weekly or a bi-weekly routine where you are tracking your expenses and you're making small adjustments to your budget. The real purpose of this is actually twofold. So first, it's going to help you audit your expenses and cut those unnecessary expenses on a regular basis anyways. But the other thing it's going to help you with is understanding your cash flow. And when you understand your cash flow, you can make more informed and more confident financial decisions. You can, deploy money towards your savings or your investments or increase your retirement contributions. And then you can actually make sure, again, the money that you are spending is actually adding value to your life long term instead of just ever so slightly leaking out of your budget every single month. Because ultimately, when it comes to budgeting, it's a really agile practice. It's supposed to be iterative. And where we lose a lot of people is, they think it's this one and done thing where if I go over in one area or maybe something in my life pops up, I'm just going to throw caution to the wind and I'm not going to look at it again. But ultimately, your budget is supposed to change with you as your life changes. And I don't know about you, but my life is changing pretty regularly. So I'm always making changes to my budget.
Just lastly, while we have you here, what if you take a look at what's coming in and out and you say, I need to make sure that a little more is coming in? What are some of the easy sources that you could start to tap and generate even more income?
Absolutely. So the first thing that comes to mind, there are 2 cash back or ways to increase your cash flow pretty quickly. One would be to make sure you have a high yield savings account for your savings. So with a high yield savings account, you can earn some extra cash on your savings already through earning higher interest on the money that's in that account. So that's a really quick way to start adding, maybe $50 to $100 a month, depending on how much money you have in that account. The other thing I would recommend you do is use cash back tools, the first that comes to mind for me is Rakuten. So for all of the shopping that you're already doing, when you use a tool like Rakuten, which you can just install with like your Google Chrome extension or via the app on your phone, you can earn cash back on the purchases you're already making, and they'll actually send you a quarterly check. And you can use that money for whatever you want. It's money that you are spending anyways, and you're just earning a little bit of extra on top of it.
Nick, good to have you here with us. Let me just get your thoughts on that survey and those findings and what it's ultimately saying about the state of Americans finding themselves in right now with regard to debt and credit cards.
Yeah, first off, thanks for having me back. The data's out, delinquencies are up, and there's over $1.2 trillion in credit card debt. We're seeing a lot of investors getting really nervous about investing in the stock market, and instead they're fleeing to cash. And what I would argue is many of those investors that are fleeing to cash would actually be better served if they take those funds and use them to pay down credit card debt instead of sitting in a cash account that might not be earning nearly as much interest as they're being charged on their credit cards.
How do you decide what kind of debt you should pay off right now and what strategy you should use?
Yeah, so I'm a math guy, I'm a numbers guy. I prefer what's called the debt avalanche, which if you're not familiar with it, it means that you prioritize paying off debt with the highest interest rate first. But we take it even a step further. So map out all of your debts, list out their interest rates. If you have any debt right now that has an interest rate above 8%, given where the market is, given where the Fed is, right now that 8% cutoff is what we're telling clients. If you have rates above 8%, pay that off before you do almost any investing.
So what about refinancing your debt? Is now a good time to do that?
For most clients, I'd say no. If you look at what the market's predicting, they're pricing in roughly 2 to 3 more rate cuts by the Fed before the end of the year. So if you're on the bubble about refinancing, I'd argue maybe sit tight. Hopefully those rates will come down 2 to 3 more times, even more than where they are right now. And that's when you should take the opportunity to refinance any high interest debt.
And so with what we were talking about in these survey findings, the number of Americans that are actually using credit, perhaps just as a bridge in order to make sure that they can get through some of the paycheck to paycheck pressures that they may be feeling, how can you ultimately, once you've started to pay down some of the debt, make sure that you're also setting up a better routine for not needing to tap credit as much?
Yeah, I saw just a headline recently where food delivery services are now offering buy now, pay later. So I think that really signals that some buyers out there are having a tough time making ends meet or living paycheck to paycheck. Sometimes it's not going to be some easy, simple answer, but taking a step back, prioritizing your goals, setting a budget that starts with your savings goals first, as opposed to what your spending goals are, that'll help make sure your priorities are aligned. And then tracking your funds on a monthly basis as well, using a budgeting app. You know, there's lots of these strategies that it's nothing necessarily new, but I would say coming into the new year, people are fresh off New Year's resolutions. Seasonality isn't really a thing with debt, but tax season is. And so if you're one of the 120 million taxpayers that's expected to get a tax refund, don't squander that influx in cash. Consider using that as a great way to jumpstart your new goals to pay down some of that credit card debt.
And while you're looking across your debt, how do you avoid some of the common pitfalls? And what are some of those frequent pitfalls that you've seen?
Yeah, I'm not anti-debt, just to be clear. I myself have like 10 credit cards. I love optimizing and getting as much value and points as you can. But we see a lot of clients really get tripped up on that. So if you are starting to go into the credit card game and trying to maximize points and miles and those types of things, one thing that you need to make sure of is look at credit cards that have a downgrade path, or sometimes it's called a product change. Google that term if you're thinking about applying for a card. What that means is you can sign up for the card, take advantage of any sign-up bonuses or great rewards that they have, but it gives you an exit path. So if that card, for whatever reason, no longer makes sense, or you can't justify the high annual fee that it has, you can downgrade or do a product change to maybe a lower fee or even a no-fee credit card. And that's going to make sure that you're not living for the short-term points and sacrificing your long-term financial future.
Coming up after the break, Affinity Federal Credit Union's Grant Gallagher and Morningstar's Christine Benz share pro advice on organizing and optimizing your finances. It's time to take action with strategies for cleaning up your finances, including optimizing your 401k, fine-tuning your investment portfolio, and more.
let's start nice and easy with a lot of people's worker-sponsored retirement plans, AKA the 401k. So what can you be doing there to make sure you're set up for the year ahead?
Well, we're still early in the year, so it's a good opportunity to see how much you're saving. We have seen the contribution limits lift a little bit over the years with inflation. So if you're under age 50, you can get $23,500 in there. That's the max. If you are over 50, it's $31,000. And then there's this catch-up, this super catch-up contribution that's available for people who are getting quite close to retirement. So between 60 and 63, you can get almost $35,000 into a 401k. So see how you're doing in terms of those contributions, because it's just such a nice, low maintenance way to get money into your account on an ongoing basis.
So moving beyond your 401k, how can you clean up your broader portfolio and make sure the investments are working for you?
Well, a really good thing to look at today would be your portfolio's mix of stocks, bonds, and cash. Use a tool. We've got a good one on Morningstar.com, but there are lots of tools available where you can check up on how your portfolio is apportioned and then compare that to your target for your asset allocation. And at this point, a lot of people might say, I do not have a target, in which case you can either get some financial advice or you can use kind of a quick and dirty route, which would be to look at a target date fund that is geared towards someone at your anticipated retirement date. See how they are allocating their assets. Today, I think a lot of older adults, like people over 50, are pretty underweight relative to the reasonable targets for safer assets. It just has not been a great place to invest over the past several years to have investments in fixed income. But I think that safety is really important for people at that life stage to at least have something in safe assets. And then people who are younger, really check that non-U.S. relative to U.S. allocation. U.S. equities have been the path of least resistance over the past couple of years. So many investors are pretty underweight non-U.S. And of course, that's where the action has been so far this year.
And so the major key of this conversation also may come in two words, and that is risk check. How can people who are viewing make sure that they are performing a risk check to make sure that they're on track with their investments and balancing that risk reward?
Yeah, so checking up on that asset allocation is a key part of this. Also check your portfolio style and sector exposure. You were just talking about the tech names, Brad. Well, even though they have had bouts of underperformance so far this year, many investors are quite overweight in those U.S. large cap tech stocks. Maybe they will continue to perform well, but most investors are pretty heavily tilted there. So check up on your style and sector exposure and see if you can't tip more into some things that haven't performed as well that may do so in the future. Also check those company overweights. So many people receive incentives via employer stock. That's a really risky area to be in because so much of people's financial wherewithal is riding on their employment.
There's a couple weeks left until taxes are due, but how can you make sure that you're utilizing tax-efficient investment strategies for the year ahead?
So first, make sure that you are maxing out those tax-sheltered account types, whether company retirement plans, IRAs are a good contribution opportunity. If you didn't contribute to 2024, you can sneak in a contribution before that tax filing deadline. If you are someone who has the wherewithal to have investments outside of retirement accounts, you just want to make sure that those are positioned as tax efficiently as possible. So their broad market index funds make sense. Exchange traded funds that track the equity market are good options. For higher income people who need to have safer investments in those taxable accounts, you'd want to look at municipal bonds. So those would be some kind of best practices. And then in retirement, there's a lot you can do in terms of managing the tax burden of the money that you're pulling out of your retirement accounts.
Grant, good to have you here with us. You have a bunch of great tips for people here, so we got to know, how can they start to create a financial filing system to keep themselves organized?
Thanks for having me, Brad. Yeah, obviously people don't get very excited when we're talking about doing your financial paperwork, tidying up. Most people, they don't really have a system in place, and that's really the first thing they need to think about. They need to create a system. They need to organize it by category. You need to involve anybody in your family who's part of that conversation. Obviously, if your documents are locked up in a fireproof safe and they need to get access to it, but you're at work, it's not going to work for your entire family. So having that conversation and kind of figuring out those first steps is where you need to start.
What's the decision tree as well for documents that you should keep versus shred versus digitize even?
So I'm a big proponent of you should really digitize everything that you can. It's very little effort to have a digital file, and then you get the benefits of you can potentially search for it. You can get some additional benefits there. But it really depends on what sort of document you're talking about. When we're talking about, your tax-related paperwork, those have a much longer shelf life. Those you want to keep on file for quite some time. If you are going to look at something like a bill, bills that have been paid, you can usually, get rid of those immediately. Bank statements, those have a little bit of a longer shelf life. You're going to want to keep those around for a year unless you need them for some sort of tax purposes. Pay stubs are also generally only useful as a backup to your W-2 at tax time. But unless you're self-employed or have really complex taxes, then, you need to keep those longer. Then, of course.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Then, of course, if you have any sort of insurance policies, you want to keep your active policy on hand and accessible, but anything that's expired or renewed, you want to keep it around for 3 years, just in case of disputes, claims, or legal issues.
So that starts to answer the question of how long you keep certain documents, but also here, when you're thinking about the importance of a financial emergency binder, it seems like there are certain documents that should go in that binder, stay in that binder for as long as necessary. What goes in there and the preparedness of that binder?
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't think a lot of people have an emergency financial binder, and they absolutely should, because the last thing you want during a crisis is have to be digging around to try to find all these papers. Things that are important to go in there is loans and credit card account numbers, housing and utility account numbers, insurance information, identity papers, property titles, tax and employment records. Of course, medical information is important. Wills and power of attorney. And then, of course, you want to have your emergency contacts, your doctors, the schools, the utilities, as well as any sort of passwords for computers and accounts. These are all things that you don't really think about, and you might have trouble remembering if you're in a crisis situation. And then last but not least, I always recommend that people make copies of the front and back of their debit cards and credit cards, because they put that number nice and conveniently right on the card. But when it's lost and stolen, it's not so convenient that it was on the card and not in your wallet or having a copy of it.
We're just a couple weeks out from tax day. Maybe people had a tough time organizing all their files this year. What do you advise for people to get ahead for next year's tax season?
Yeah, now is the time to learn from your lessons and your mistakes from this year and start now. Put together a folder now of what a place where you can put these documents. It's a good opportunity to, think about what did you miss, what did you have to dig for, and take advantage of that. Start putting your donations in that folder. Start thinking about how you can better organize it, because, again, you don't want to be tempted to have some important document and just stick it in a pile for later. A lot of us kind of get lazy about that, but do your future self a favor, create some sort of filing system for next year now, and then, you won't have to worry about it, and it'll be a much smoother tax season next year.
And so with that in mind, how do you see a lot of the older generations kind of passing down their tips for which files they need to be keeping versus digitizing to the next generations that are digital first?
Yeah. There is a little bit of a challenge there with somebody who's traditionally a paper first individual. You can help them out by helping scan them, helping teach them how to do these things. Mm-hmm. But of course, if they're sticking to a paper first file, they should really make that their plan. Right. You shouldn't do half paper, half digital. That's just going to lead to some scenarios where you're digging around looking for a
right.
paper. because you thought you digitized it, but you didn't actually do it.
Yeah.
And I am speaking from personal experience here.
After the break, Decoding Retirement host Bob Powell explains why keeping beneficiary designations up to date, especially after major life events, is crucial for financial security. Decoding Retirement host Bob Powell joins us to discuss the importance of reviewing and updating your beneficiary designations. Bob, great to see you. We got to know what, first and foremost, is a beneficiary? What defines a beneficiary, and why is making sure you have one or more so important?
Yeah, so a beneficiary is someone that you legally designate to receive your assets after you pass away, after you die. Pleasant subject.
But necessary.
But extremely necessary. So one of the things that these assets, some assets, not all, but your life insurance, your annuity, your IRA, your 401k, all get passed to a person you designate through a beneficiary designation.
Certainly. And so spring seems like a good time to check in on your beneficiaries, but when else do you need to consider making changes?
Well, I think anytime there's a significant life event, the birth of a child, a divorce, the death of a spouse, et cetera, it's always a good time to check in on your beneficiary designations. The last thing that you want to have happen, Brad, and it often does, is someone might get divorced. And then the next thing you know, that person dies, but they never change the beneficiary designation, so their ex-spouse gets $1 million in life insurance proceeds because someone forgot to change their beneficiary designation. So two things, why is it so important? The beneficiary designation allows you to direct who will get the assets after you die. So there's the primary beneficiary that you need to name, and also a contingent beneficiary. So maybe you might name your spouse as your primary, and then your children as your contingent beneficiaries. And those are really important. Now, the other thing about this is beneficiary designations. Let's say you don't have a beneficiary on your IRA or your life insurance policy.
Sure.
Then those assets get distributed according to state laws. And it may end up that these assets go to someone that you didn't want to have. So it's really important to check these things. And tax season is a good time to do that because oftentimes you're asked on your tax form to look at your IRA assets,
right.
Form 5498, I think it's called. And that's a good time to say, okay, well, I'm looking at my traditional IRA, I should also look at my beneficiary designations. The other thing that I should note too, Brad, we talked about contingent beneficiaries. You can name multiple beneficiaries and have the assets split up on a percentage basis or on an equal basis, et cetera. So don't think that it's just one person. It could be multiple people that are receiving your IRA, life insurance proceeds, et cetera.
Walk me through some of the documents that are critical to make sure you're up to date with your estate planning, and what are some examples?
All right, so the most common example is a will that designates who gets your assets after you pass away. But there are several others that are really important. The durable power for financial matters designates someone to handle your financial accounts if you become incapacitated. Then there's something called the durable powers for healthcare matters, or sometimes a healthcare proxy, and that designates who will make healthcare decisions for you if you become incapacitated. And then the last thing would be the advance directive, which sort of outlines what are your wishes for end-of-life care. Sometimes a living will is part of that document because that says what kind of drastic measures should be used or not used to keep you alive. And then there are two others. Sometimes estate planning attorneys will include them. One is something called the DNR, the Do Not Resuscitate, and the other is something called the Medical or Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. Again, it outlines how far you want a doctor to go in order to keep you alive or not.
How young should you be when you're creating these documents?
I think the moment you reach the age of majority, you should have all these documents in place. So once you're 18, you need all these documents in place, including, we didn't mention, but a HIPAA release, which allows someone, a doctor, to talk to your loved ones that you've designated to hear medical information about you. And so the moment you turn 19, your parents aren't legally allowed to talk to the physician unless there's a HIPAA release in place.
Thanks for watching. Stay tuned to Yahoo Finance for the latest financial news and updates.